Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill, and today's video is going to be part 2 of a 3-part series on the life of Georgi Rakovski. If you didn't catch part 1, I would recommend watching that video first. I'll put a link down below in the comments section and in the description. But like I said, this video is going to be part 2, and we're going to be focusing mainly on the formation and the activities of the Bulgarian Legion. And I'll once again be quoting from the biography of Georgi Rakovski by Veselin Traikov. Now, when we left off in the last video, it was around the year 1853. The Crimean War had just started, and Georgi Rakovski, who was 32 years old, was working as a translator for the Ottomans at their army headquarters in Bulgaria. Now, it was Rakovski's plan to aid the Russians in their war effort against the Ottomans, and his plan was to raise a force of Bulgarian insurgents who would take the mountain passes in the Balkan Mountains and essentially cut off the Ottomans from the Danubian principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. Now, unfortunately for Rakovski, the Ottomans discovered his plan, and before he could put it into action, he was arrested and taken into custody. Now, he managed to escape from his arrest and went into hiding in Bulgaria for the remainder of the war. Now, if we fast forward a few years to 1856, when Rakovski is 35 years old, the Crimean War will have come to an end and will have resulted in a Russian defeat. Now, with Bulgaria being unquestionably and solidly under Ottoman control, Rakovski will flee Bulgaria to Belgrade, to Serbia, in order to continue his revolutionary activities there. However, he will quickly leave Belgrade due to the fact that the Karađorđević regime, which is in control of Serbia at this time, is very unfriendly towards Rakovski, towards his revolutionary ideas. So he will then relocate to the Serbian city of Novi Sad, which at this time is in the autonomous Serbian region located within the Austrian Empire.
Novi Sad at that time was the cultural center of the Serbian people. It was the center of democratic ideas amid the Serbian society. Srpski Dnevnik was published in Novi Sad. It was one of the most popular and well-edited papers, which contained a great number of articles and facts about the enslaved Balkan nations. Its editor, Dr. Danilo Medaković, an educated Serb and brilliant journalist who was greatly interested in history, sympathized with the Bulgarian cause. Therefore, it was quite natural that Rakovski sought to establish contact with him. The two prominent functionaries soon found a common language. Rakovski was soon enlisted by Medaković in the editorial office of Srpski Dnevnik.
While in Novi Sad, Rakovski published a weekly newspaper called Bulgarska Dnevnica. He also published a second newspaper / literary journal known as Dunavski Lebed, or Danubian Swan.
During his stay in Novi Sad, Rakovski established contact with a number of prominent Serbs living there at that time, who later played a considerable role in the political and cultural life of Serbia. Rakovski, for his part, who had experienced the influence of this cultural Serbian environment, impressed the Vojvodina Serbs with his energy, love for his people, and his intellect. While in Novi Sad, Rakovski began to translate textbooks for the Bulgarian schools, to collect folklore, and to look for information connected with Bulgaria's history.
However, the authorities quickly discovered and cracked down on this revolutionary activity.
Soon, many reports about the struggles of the Bulgarians against the Greek Phanariot clergy and the lawless actions of the Ottoman rulers with regard to the Bulgarian people began reaching the editorial office of Bulgarska Dnevnica. This naturally attracted the attention of the Sublime Porte. The Turkish government took measures to stop the publication of a newspaper which went very much against the grain. At the request of the Turkish government, the Austrian authorities confiscated number 19 of the paper, stopped its publication, arrested Rakovski, and sent him towards Zemun with the intention to deliver him to the Turkish Pasha in Belgrade. After Rakovski's vigorous protests, the authorities decided to expel him from the country and send him to Wallachia.
After leaving Novi Sad, Rakovski would go back to the Bulgarian colony in the Moldavian city of Galați, where he had been engaged in some revolutionary activity years prior.
Having reached the big Danubian port town, Rakovski's plan was to set up a literary society, as well as a Bulgarian printing house, which his people were deprived of. He was supported by the Galați Bulgarians, and issued an appeal for the setting up of a Bulgarian literary society, in which he pointed out the necessity of education if a Bulgarian national self-consciousness were to be developed. According to him, a man without education and knowledge was as good as dead.
However, it was not long before Rakovski's literary activities were disrupted. Once the Ottomans found out that he was trying to reestablish his newspaper, they quickly intervened. The Sublime Porte had ordered the Moldavian prince to arrest this quote-unquote dangerous rebel and have him turned over. Rakovski had no other choice but to flee the Danubian Principality of Moldavia.
This time, Rakovski made for the blessed land of Russia, mother of the Slav people and protector of the Bulgarians, as Rakovski himself put it. The Bulgarian revolutionary, after a brief stay in the frontier settlement of Kubay, settled in Odessa, where he remained until the beginning of 1860.
Now, under Russian protection, Rakovski engaged in prolific writing and publication, mainly around the topic of Bulgarian folklore. He was also briefly appointed as the supervisor at the Orthodox seminary in the city of Kherson. Rakovski would go on to petition the Russian authorities numerous times for a press permit in order to begin republishing his newspapers Bulgarska Dnevnica and Dunavski Lebed. However, his petitions were denied by the Russian authorities due to Rakovski's anti-Phanariot positions and his positions around the Bulgarian church question. And this is due to the fact that the Russians are very hostile to the creation of an independent Bulgarian church and are very friendly with the Phanariots in Constantinople. By 1860, Rakovski would decide to leave Russia and go to Wallachia, where he would stay briefly before making his way back to Belgrade. Now, you might be wondering why Rakovski decides to go back to Belgrade after having initially left the city a few years earlier, and that is due to the fact that Serbia is now under a new administration, a new regime, which is much friendlier to Rakovski and his activities. In 1858, Prince Alexander Karađorđević will abdicate the throne, and Miloš Obrenović will take over as the leader of the Serbian Principality. A couple years later, in 1860, Miloš Obrenović will die, and his son, Mihail Obrenović, will inherit the Serbian throne. Now, due to the fact that Mihail Obrenović is very hostile towards the Ottoman authorities, to the Ottoman regime, he is much more sympathetic to Rakovski's cause than Karađorđević was. Rakovski will in fact be given Serbian citizenship, which will protect him from Ottoman deportation. And in fact, in 1860, the Serbian authorities will give Rakovski permission to begin republishing his newspapers, specifically Dunavski Lebed, or Danubian Swan.
At first, the general tone of the newspaper was rather moderate. Rakovski tried to emphasize and point out the advantages which the different European powers would have from the solution of the Bulgarian question. He tried to be convincing. In order to facilitate a larger circulation of the paper, Rakovski began to have, after its 17th issue, parts of the material published in French. This was the first Bulgarian forum representing the national cause before foreign readers.
Now, that paper dealt with a lot of different topics, a lot of different political topics and current events. However, its main focus was on the church question in Bulgaria.
Rakovski took an active part in the struggles of the Bulgarian people for church independence. While still a schoolboy, he manifested his hostile attitude towards the Greek Phanariot clergy, towards those light extinguishers and scorners of the Bulgarian nation, as he called the Phanariots, in 1839. In the Ottoman Empire, the church occupied a prominent place in the life of the state. It was the church that represented the respective nation before the authorities. It was the church that looked after the education of the people, that collected sizable taxes, that influenced the economic life of all the people. Rakovski realized that without the solution of the church question, the Bulgarian people could not improve their fate, could not confidently and with all their strength embark on the road of political liberation. That is why the struggle of the ardent Bulgarian patriot against the Istanbul Greek Patriarchate was fierce. The Phanariot clergy, as Rakovski had repeatedly pointed out, had nurtured an irreconcilable hatred towards the Bulgarians. They did not allow the Bulgarian language in the church services. They closed the Bulgarian schools, slandered the Bulgarians before the Turkish government, and imposed exorbitant fines upon them. The Greek clergy had a dual purpose. It strove on the one hand to amass riches at the expense of the Bulgarians, and on the other hand, which was still more oppressive and dangerous, it strove to assimilate and Hellenize them. This is the reason why Rakovski launched an uncompromising dispute with the Istanbul Patriarchate. The Greek megali idea, embraced by the Free Greek state and pursued as official policy, constituted a deadly danger for the Bulgarians. This is why Rakovski continuously denounced, fought, and argued with those who supported the Fanariates, and at the same time encouraged and inspired all fighters against foreign church oppression.
While in Belgrade, Rakovski was not just engaged in a literary activity, but he was also plotting another Bulgarian uprising. In fact, he was coordinating with the Serbs who were planning on attacking the Ottoman garrisons located within Serbia.
The Serbian government assisted in the organizing of a Bulgarian military unit. Word spread about this military unit all over the country. The number of Bulgarian patriots who joined Rakovski in Belgrade was rapidly increasing. Many of the future leaders of the Bulgarian national liberation movement were among them. Towards the end of 1861, Rakovski worked out a special plan for the liberation of Bulgaria. According to that plan, a well-armed regiment was to set out for the Serbian border and continue eastward along the ridge of the Balkan Mountains, which runs across the whole country. This regiment was to coordinate its actions with the developments in Serbia. Its ultimate goal would be to reach Trnovo, where, according to the plan, the number of insurgents would be approximately 150,000 people, 40,000 of whom were to be armed. The liberation movement was to spread as far as the areas along the sea, so that about 500,000 people were to rise up in arms. Under these circumstances, Rakovski considered the successful outcome of his plan as certain. All efforts of the ardent Bulgarian revolutionary were focused on the preparation of the armed military unit which was to bear the brunt of the fighting. One of the participants in the Bulgarian Legion, Jordan Planinsky, wrote in his notes about the training of the first independent Bulgarian regiment organized and supplied with all the necessary equipment, which also had a tricolored silk flag, green, white, and red, with a golden lion on the green field. The Bulgarian military unit studied military service, was drilled in shooting, marching, and covering long distances. We'd even mastered military discipline, wrote Planinsky further, and described the appearance of his commander thusly. Rakovski was dressed in an old Bulgarian uniform, and had a white fur cap on his head, adorned with a golden-maned lion. His military coat was made of red broadcloth, his trousers of green broadcloth. He wore black patent leather boots with spurs, and his mantle, his outer piece of clothing, had no sleeves and reached down to his heels. His look was heroic. He walked in Belgrade accompanied by 2 or 3 of his young warriors, something like an honorary escort.
While the Bulgarian volunteers were gathering in Belgrade, the Ottomans were also reinforcing their positions. They were amassing soldiers in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They were also moving into Montenegro. Additionally, they were also reinforcing their fortresses and garrisons within Serbia itself, particularly the fortress in Belgrade. As this was going on, tensions between Turks and Serbs was very much growing in the city, and you would see occasional clashes breaking out between the two sides. In fact, in June of 1862, during one of these clashes, a young Serbian man was killed, and that night a skirmish broke out between the Serbian forces and the Ottomans.
Almost all of the Bulgarian volunteers took part in the fighting which ensued. The skirmish on that day was only the beginning of the conflict. Much of the heavier fighting took place 2 days later, when, in the early morning, and without any real reason, the Turkish fortress artillery began shelling Belgrade. The shelling lasted 4.5 hours, inflicting heavy casualties on the population. Rakovski and his military unit, who had taken up convenient positions near one of the fortress's barricades, took an active part in the fresh outburst of fighting. With his sword drawn, Rakovski encouraged his warriors, who were fighting on the front line. Some time later, when a lull in the fighting set in, Rakovski delivered a short speech. He told his warriors that the long-anticipated moment for the liberation of their homeland had come. Arms in hand, they would soon own the boundaries of Bulgaria. Until then, however, it was necessary that they should help our sister Serbia. The Bulgarian Legion later participated in the siege of the Belgrade fortress, which was in Turkish hands. They captured a sector around the fortress. At the same time, the Bulgarian warriors were undergoing strenuous military training in anticipation of further developments.
During a pause in the fighting and the hostilities, Rakovski would put the Bulgarian Revolution into motion. He formed a provisional government in Belgrade which would direct a general uprising in Bulgaria. Rakovski sent detachments into Bulgaria to prepare the people for revolution and lead them to war. However, as Rakovski was preparing to lead his legion across the border into Bulgaria, he received a very concerning letter.
The prominent Bulgarian functionary, Dr. Vukovic, wrote to Rakovski from Paris, It is rumored in Istanbul and elsewhere that the Serbian government was not going to help us get rid of our tyrants, that it only intended to use us as a scarecrow in order to obtain from the Turks what it wanted, that we should only be used as a cat's paw. Indeed, the course of developments was not favorable to the Bulgarians. After their intervention in the conflict between Serbia and Turkey, the European powers summoned their ambassadors in Kandili, a settlement near Istanbul, where they discussed the question of a peaceful settlement of the dispute. On August 27, 1862, they signed a special protocol for settling the conflict. At the request of the British ambassador, one article of the protocol provided for the immediate disbandment of all military units made up of volunteers, the Bulgarian Legion of Rakovski included. The protocol, having been signed by all the great powers, was handed over to the Serbian government for implementation. In accordance with the protocol's provisions, on September 7th, the Bulgarian Legion was ordered to disband, the soldiers to be dismissed, and the arms, which were Rakovski's property, to be returned to him. Thus the plans for an uprising in Bulgaria came to nothing. The efforts of the Bulgarians had been used for a cause which did not benefit them. Being a good political realist, however, Rakovski accepted this fact. He had no other choice.
Now, despite Rakovski's extreme disappointment with the way this whole scenario played out, he was still willing to work with the Serbian government. In fact, shortly after this whole incident, he was hired by the Serbians to smuggle Russian weapons into Serbia through Romania. And the reason why Rakovski was still willing to deal with the Serbian government was because he was still very much motivated by this pan-Balkan vision he had, this idea of a common struggle against the Ottoman Empire. And it was for this reason that the Serbian government actually hired him to go to Athens as a Serbian emissary in order to collaborate with the Greek government in forming a Balkan alliance against the Turks.
This choice was not accidental. The great Bulgarian functionary was well known to the Serbian government. As editor of the Danubian Swan, he enjoyed wide popularity not only among the Bulgarians, but also among the foreign diplomatic circles, where his activity was also well known and where he was held in high esteem. His participation in the fighting near the Belgrade fortress, while leading the Bulgarian Legion, and his assistance in transferring Russian arms across Romania to Serbia had made him quite popular. He had an excellent command of the Greek language due to his classical education. His fame as a poet, writer, scholar, and fanatic Democrat, the soul of the national liberation movement in Bulgaria, and champion of the idea of a common struggle on the Balkans. All of these things made the Serbian government choose the popular Bulgarian functionary as its emissary to Greece.
Rakovski, however, quickly became disillusioned with this whole project.
The atmosphere in the Greek capital at that time was far from favorable for negotiations. The first king of Greece, Otto, having been dethroned after the People's Revolution, had been expelled from the country, which was then in a state of interregnum. The political parties, at enmity with one another, plunged into a struggle for power. Rakovski used his own code to inform the Serbian government about the situation in Greece, where disorder and murders had become ever more frequent. "Total anarchy reigns here," he wrote in one of his reports. His stay in the Greek capital was pointless. Anti-Slavic feelings, skillfully stimulated by England, were taking the upper hand. Even wider circles became gripped by intensified nationalism. According to supporters of this mood, England was expected to render assistance in building up of a greater Greece, whose boundaries would stretch as far as the deep north of the Balkans. It was in Athens that Rakovski learned about some earlier negotiations between the Greeks and the Serbians, held a year and a half before, at the expense of the Bulgarians. The agreement reached between the Serbians and the Greeks opened the road for further territorial acquisitions at the expense of Bulgarian lands.
From this point forward, Rakovski's pan-Balkan vision gives way to the idea of Bulgarian nationalism.
Rakovski departed for Belgrade and left as his deputy in Athens the young Bulgarian, Marko Balabanov, who was studying in the Greek capital at that time. Disappointed in the chances of reaching some kind of an alliance with the Greeks, Rakovski also realized how ephemeral the chances were for an agreement with the Serbs. It was at about this time that he wrote his notes on Serbian foreign policy. He viewed the trends in the policy of Prince Mihail Obrenović and Prime Minister Garashanin critically and assessed them as unfavorable for the advancement of the Southern Slavs. Rakovski hesitated for a long time, wondering whether he should set about writing his book entitled Modern Political Relations of the Serbian Principality with Bulgaria. He considered this work as a friendly warning, because dissension and disagreement had driven both the Bulgarians and the Serbs into a grim situation. Rakovski pointed out that each nation should pursue such a policy that benefited above all its own interests. Each nation should, however, keep in mind the existing situation. He remarked further that the Bulgarians could keep an alliance with the Serbs, but only after each of the two nations' rights were clearly defined. The Bulgarians, he wrote, were not willing to shed their blood as they had done in the past for the interests of Serbia and Greece, just because those two countries were fighting against the common oppressor. They were not willing to sacrifice their lives for the cross and the faith, with no favorable results for the Bulgarian nation.
Rakovski left Serbia shortly thereafter and relocated to Bucharest, where he continued his work. And that will be the topic of the next and final part of this three-part series on Georgi Rakovski. Until then, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.